The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Air Station North Island as Lieutenant Commander Zara, Phantom, Reeves stepped out of the staff car, her service dress blues pristine despite the California heat. The SEAL compound loomed ahead, a fortress of concrete and steel that had witnessed decades of America's most classified operations. She carried herself with the measured confidence of someone who had learned to prove herself in rooms full of doubt, her stride purposeful as she approached the main gate. "Ma'am, you're here for the briefing." The young Marine Guard's tone carried just enough skepticism to remind Zara why she'd stopped correcting assumptions years ago. She simply nodded, presenting her credentials with the same steady expression she'd worn through countless similar encounters. The guard's eyes lingered on her wings, naval aviator insignia that seemed almost out of place in this testosterone-heavy environment. Inside the briefing room, 12 SEALs sat arranged in 2 rows, their attention focused on a map of the Pacific dotted with red markers. Each marker represented a failed extraction attempt over the past 6 months. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone willing to see it. Traditional helicopter insertions weren't working against increasingly sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems. The enemy had adapted, evolved, learned to read the rhythm of American tactics. Commander Jake "Hammer" Morrison stood at the front, his weathered face bearing the weight of too many unsuccessful missions. When Zara entered, conversations died mid-sentence. The silence wasn't hostile exactly, but it carried the unmistakable weight of men wondering why a pilot was sitting in on their operational briefing. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of 2 decades in special operations, "meet Lieutenant Commander Reeves. She's here to observe our insertion protocols." The word "observe" hung in the air like a challenge nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. Several SEALs exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that develops between operators who have bled together. Zara settled into a chair at the back, her notebook balanced on her knee. She'd learned long ago that the best way to handle skepticism was with competence, not confrontation. Her eyes moved across the tactical display, processing flight patterns, threat assessments, and insertion timelines with the analytical precision that had earned her a reputation in circles these men had never heard of. The briefing continued with Morrison outlining their next target, a high-value asset trapped behind enemy lines in the South China Sea. Every traditional extraction method had failed. Helicopters were sitting ducks. Fixed-wing aircraft couldn't land in the terrain. The clock was ticking, and options were running out. In the corner of the room, Zara's pen moved across her notebook, sketching flight paths that existed only in her mind. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, studying the woman who'd somehow earned a seat at their table. He'd seen plenty of observers over the years, Pentagon officials, foreign liaisons, journalists with clearances. But something about Reeves felt different. She wasn't taking notes like someone trying to understand their world. She was taking notes like someone already thinking 3 moves ahead. Her fingers drummed against her notebook in a rhythm that reminded him of rotor blades, and when Morrison mentioned the failed helicopter insertions, he caught something flickering across her face. Not sympathy, but calculation. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the hour. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture of their target's location, a heavily defended compound on an island barely large enough to accommodate a basketball court, surrounded by overlapping radar coverage and mobile missile launchers. Conventional wisdom said it was impossible. Every simulation ended in failure. Every war game concluded with acceptable losses that were, in human terms, completely unacceptable. "Sir," came a voice from the second row, belonging to Petty Officer Williams, "what about alternative insertion methods?" The question hung in the room like smoke, and Zara felt every pair of eyes turn toward Morrison. She'd been wondering the same thing, but from a perspective none of these men had considered. Morrison's jaw tightened. "We've explored every option, Williams. Maritime approaches are compromised by patrol boats. Airborne insertions face a wall of SAMs. High-altitude drops put the team too far from target with no extraction guarantee. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing, almost accidentally, on Zara. Unless someone has a miracle tucked away somewhere. The words were meant rhetorically, but they created a moment of possibility that Zara had been waiting for. She closed her notebook and stood, her movement subtle but somehow commanding attention. "Commander Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the same measured authority that had once talked a crippled FA-18 through a carrier landing in 40-foot seas. "What if I told you there's an aircraft in your inventory that nobody's considered for this mission?" The silence that followed wasn't skeptical, it was hungry. These were men accustomed to impossible missions, trained to find solutions where others saw only problems. When someone offered hope, they listened with the intensity of people whose brothers' lives hung in the balance. Morrison's expression shifted from polite tolerance to genuine interest. "I'm listening, Lieutenant Commander." The formal address carried new weight, acknowledging that perhaps there was more to this observer than anyone had assumed. Around the room, SEALs leaned forward almost imperceptibly, their body language transforming from passive attention to active engagement. Zara stepped toward the tactical display, her movements economical and precise. "You're thinking about this mission in terms of traditional aircraft," she began, her finger tracing the island's perimeter on the map. "Helicopters are slow and vulnerable. Jets are fast but can't provide sustained support or precision insertion." She paused, letting the familiar limitations settle in their minds before introducing the variable they hadn't considered. "But there's a third option, an aircraft designed for exactly this kind of impossible mission, flown by pilots trained to thread needles that shouldn't exist." Her eyes met Morrison's across the room. "The AV-8B Harrier. Specifically, a Harrier with someone who spent the last 8 years learning to make it do things the engineers never imagined." The response was immediate and predictable. Several SEALs chuckled, the kind of polite laughter reserved for well-meaning civilians who didn't understand the complexities of special operations. Rodriguez shook his head slightly, not unkindly, but with the weary patience of someone explaining reality to an outsider. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Williams interjected, his tone carrying the carefully neutral professionalism of someone trying not to offend, "the Harrier's a ground attack aircraft. It's not designed for precision troop insertion. The downdraft alone would create exactly the kind of chaos that masks a SEAL insertion," Zara interrupted smoothly, her voice never rising but somehow cutting through the room's skepticism like a blade through silk. "The downdraft that everybody worries about becomes your cover. The noise that alerts enemies becomes their confusion. And the aircraft that everyone assumes can't perform surgical strikes becomes the scalpel that cuts through their defenses." Morrison found himself reconsidering assumptions he'd held for 20 years. The Harrier had always been a blunt instrument in his mind, powerful but lacking the finesse required for the kind of work his teams did. But something in Reeves' tone suggested she wasn't speaking theoretically. "Lieutenant Commander," he said carefully, "are you suggesting you've done this before?" Zara's smile was subtle, the kind that hinted at stories she wasn't authorized to tell. "I'm suggesting that there are capabilities in your air wing that haven't been fully explored for special operations applications. The Harrier's vertical takeoff and landing capability isn't just about convenience. It's about accessing places and providing support that no other fixed-wing aircraft can match." The room's atmosphere had shifted subtly. What began as polite attention to a visiting observer had evolved into something approaching professional consultation. These men were experienced enough to recognize expertise when they heard it, regardless of the package it came in. Rodriguez studied Zara with new interest. "Ma'am, what's your background with the Harrier?" The question opened a door that Zara had been waiting for someone to ask about. 1,800 flight hours in type, she replied matter-of-factly, "including time with the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit where we developed some unconventional applications for the platform." She paused, gauging their reaction. I've put Marines exactly where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, in places that officially don't exist on any map. Morrison felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in ways he hadn't expected. Continue, Lieutenant Commander. Zara moved to the whiteboard, picking up a marker with the same confidence she'd once gripped a control stick during her first carrier landing. The key is understanding that the Harrier isn't trying to be a helicopter. It's being something entirely different. Watch. She began sketching a flight profile that looked unlike anything the SEALs had seen in their briefings. Approach from the northwest below radar coverage, using the island's topography to mask approach. Short vertical takeoff from a position 2 nautical miles out, allowing for maximum fuel efficiency and minimal exposure time. Her marker traced a path that seemed to defy conventional tactical wisdom. Insertion window, 45 seconds. Extract window, 30 seconds. Total exposure to enemy fire, less than 2 minutes. Williams squinted at the diagram. Ma'am, the math doesn't work. The Harrier can't hover that long with a full load. You're right, Zara agreed, turning back to face the room. It can't hover that long, but it doesn't need to hover. She drew another line on the board, this one representing a movement pattern that looked almost like a dance. Controlled vertical flight isn't the same as hovering. The aircraft maintains forward momentum, using its thrust vectoring to create a stable platform while never remaining stationary long enough to become a target. The concept was beginning to crystallize for Morrison. He'd seen enough tactical innovations over the years to recognize when someone was describing something that had moved beyond theory. Lieutenant Commander, how many times have you executed this type of insertion? Zara's expression remained carefully neutral. I'm not at liberty to discuss specific operations, sir, but I can tell you that the technique has been tested under combat conditions. The diplomatic non-answer told Morrison everything he needed to know about the classification level of her experience. Master Chief Rodriguez leaned forward. What about extraction? Getting the team out is usually harder than putting them in. Same principle, different execution, Zara replied, adding new lines to her diagram. The Harrier approaches the extraction point with what appears to be a standard attack run. Enemy forces react to defend against air-to-ground ordnance. During that reaction window, the aircraft transitions to vertical flight, extracts the team, and transitions back to forward flight before enemy forces can adapt. She paused, studying the faces around the room. The key is that every movement looks like something else until the moment of truth. By the time the enemy understands what's happening, it's already over. The room fell silent as 12 Special Operations veterans processed what they'd just heard. These were men trained to think outside conventional parameters, to find solutions in spaces where others saw only problems. But what Reeves was describing challenged assumptions they'd built careers on. Petty Officer Jenkins spoke up from the back. Ma'am, what's your failure rate with this technique? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Zara met it directly. In 18 insertions using this method, I've brought every team home. She let that sink in before adding, sometimes not exactly on schedule and sometimes not exactly according to plan, but home. Morrison found himself faced with a decision that could change everything or cost everything. The traditional approaches had failed consistently. His men were professionals who deserved every possible advantage, and now he had a pilot claiming she could deliver something impossible. Lieutenant Commander, he said finally, I need you to understand something. These aren't training exercises. The people we're trying to extract, if this fails, they don't get a second chance. His voice carried the weight of every operator he'd lost over 20 years. Zara nodded slowly. Sir, I understand the stakes. That's exactly why I'm here. She set down the marker and faced the room directly. I didn't come here to observe your operation. I came here to offer you a solution that might actually work. The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the briefing. Morrison realized they'd been operating under false assumptions from the moment Reeves walked through the door. "What exactly is your role in this mission, Lieutenant Commander?" "That depends on you, Commander," Zara replied. "I can continue observing and write a report that nobody will read, or I can show you what's possible when you stop thinking about limitations and start thinking about capabilities." Rodriguez laughed, not mockingly, but with the appreciation of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. "Ma'am, I think what the commander's trying to ask is whether you're volunteering to fly this mission." Zara's smile was answer enough, but she provided words anyway. "Master Chief, I've been volunteering since the moment I walked in here. The question isn't whether I'm willing, it's whether you're ready to try something that's never been attempted at this level." Morrison found himself at a crossroads that would define not just this mission, but potentially how special operations approached air support in the future. Every instinct told him to stick with proven methods, but every proven method had failed. Standing before him was a pilot offering something unprecedented, backed by experience he couldn't verify but somehow believed. "What do you need?" he asked. The question unleashed a flood of possibilities that Zara had been planning since the moment she read the mission brief. 48 hours for aircraft preparation and team integration training. I'll need your insertion team to understand how this differs from helicopter operations, and I'll need complete tactical control once we're airborne." "Complete tactical control?" Williams questioned. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but you're talking about a ground operation." "No," Zara corrected. "I'm talking about an air operation that happens to put people on the ground. Once my aircraft enters the battle space, every decision affects the team's survival. I need authority commensurate with responsibility." Morrison weighed the implications. Giving tactical control to a pilot violated standard doctrine, but standard doctrine had been failing for 6 months. Done. What else? "I'll need the most current intelligence on enemy air defenses, weather patterns for the next 72 hours, and a team that trusts me enough to follow instructions that might not make sense until they're already working." Rodriguez grinned. "Ma'am, if you can get us to target and back, we'll follow instructions that don't make sense, instructions that make perfect sense, and instructions that exist somewhere in between." The commitment was exactly what Zara had hoped for. Special operations success depended on trust between people who might never see each other again after the mission. "Then, let's get started." Morrison called for a 15-minute break, and as the SEALs filed out for coffee and conversation, he approached Zara with the cautious respect of someone recognizing that his assumptions had been comprehensively wrong. "Lieutenant Commander, I need to ask, why didn't you lead with this? Why let us think you were just observing?" Zara's expression was thoughtful. "Sir, would you have listened to a pilot you'd never heard of walking in and claiming she could solve problems that had stumped your best planners?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Sometimes you have to let people discover the solution on their own terms." Morrison nodded slowly. "What aren't you telling me about this technique?" "That it works because it shouldn't," Zara replied honestly. "The enemy plans for helicopters and jets, but they don't plan for something that's neither and both. The Harrier in this configuration exploits a blind spot in their thinking." "And the risks are substantial," she acknowledged. "But they're calculated risks, and they're better than the certainty of failure you've been facing." Morrison made his decision with the finality of someone who'd learned to trust his instincts above regulations. 48 hours, Lieutenant Commander. Show me what's possible." The next 2 days transformed Naval Air Station North Island into a laboratory of tactical innovation. Zara worked with the SEAL team to develop hand signals and communication protocols that would function in the unique environment of a Harrier insertion. The noise, downdraft, and confined space created challenges that traditional helicopter training hadn't addressed. Williams emerged as an unexpected ally. his initial skepticism evolving into genuine curiosity about the tactical possibilities. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about the extraction phase. What if we're taking fire during the pickup?" "Then we adapt," Zara replied, sketching modifications to their approach on the hangar's whiteboard. "The Harrier can provide close air support while transitioning to extraction mode. Instead of a sitting duck, you get a guardian angel with teeth." Rodriguez appreciated the elegance of the concept. "It's like having a gunship and transport in one package." "Exactly. And because it's unexpected, the enemy's response will be delayed and confused." Zara had run enough combat missions to understand that confusion was often more valuable than firepower. The aircraft itself required modifications that pushed the boundaries of authorized configurations. Zara worked with the maintenance chief to install additional secure radio equipment and modify the passenger compartment to accommodate 4 fully equipped SEALs. Every change was documented and approved through proper channels, but the speed of implementation reflected the mission's priority. On the morning of insertion, the team gathered in the pre-dawn darkness of the flight line. The Harrier sat under floodlights, its angular silhouette looking more like a sculpture of aggression than an aircraft. Final weather reports confirmed acceptable conditions, and intelligence updates showed no changes in enemy dispositions. Morrison approached Zara as she completed her pre-flight inspection. "Lieutenant Commander, I want you to know, regardless of how this turns out, you've changed how we think about the possible." "Sir, let's make sure it turns out well first," she replied, but her tone carried the confidence of someone who'd visualized success in every detail. The SEAL team boarded with the efficiency of people whose lives depended on precise coordination. Each man carried equipment optimized for the mission profile Zara had designed. Their weapons were suppressed, their communications encrypted, and their movements calculated to complement rather than fight the aircraft's unique capabilities. As the Harrier's engine spooled up, the familiar whine building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the entire airfield, Zara felt the familiar pre-mission calm that had carried her through countless operations. This wasn't just another mission. It was proof of concept for a new way of thinking about air-ground integration. "Control, Phantom Flight requesting clearance for departure," she transmitted, using her call sign for what might be its most important mission. "Phantom Flight, you are cleared for departure. Good hunting." The Harrier lifted off vertically, transitioning to forward flight with the smooth precision that had taken Zara years to master. Behind her, 4 SEALs experienced something that existed nowhere else in aviation: the unique sensation of vertical takeoff in a fighter aircraft, watching the ground fall away as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions. The flight to target took 2 hours, following a route that avoided populated areas and commercial air traffic. Zara maintained radio discipline while providing her passengers with updates on their progress and approach conditions. The weather was holding, enemy air defenses showed no unusual activity, and their target remained in position. "30 minutes to target," she announced over the intercom. "Remember, once we begin our approach, everything happens fast. Trust your training, follow the procedures we rehearsed, and let the aircraft do what it does best." Rodriguez keyed his mic. "Roger that, Phantom, we're ready." The final approach began at wave-top level, the Harrier skimming across the ocean's surface below radar coverage. Zara's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, managing the transition from high-speed flight to the controlled vertical capabilities that would make the insertion possible. "Target island bearing 090, range 5 miles, she reported. "Beginning final approach sequence." Through their headsets, the SEALs could hear the subtle changes in engine tone as Zara began the complex process of reconfiguring the aircraft for vertical flight while maintaining forward momentum. It was a dance between pilot and machine that few people in the world had mastered. 2 miles to target, stand by for insertion." The island grew from a speck on the horizon to a defined landmass with visible structures and defensive positions. Intelligence photographs had been accurate. This was a fortress in miniature, designed to be impregnable to conventional assault. 1 mile out, final systems check. Zara's voice remained calm despite the approaching complexity of the next few minutes. Every system showed green. Weather conditions were optimal. Enemy activity appeared normal, suggesting they hadn't detected the approaching aircraft. Beginning vertical transition, now. The Harrier's transformation from horizontal to vertical flight was something its passengers would remember for the rest of their lives. The aircraft seemed to pivot in midair, its thrust vectoring nozzles rotating to redirect the engine's power downward while maintaining precise control over position and attitude. Insertion point in sight, 30 seconds. Below them, the target location appeared exactly as briefed, a small clearing surrounded by dense vegetation, close enough to their objective for rapid movement but far enough to avoid immediate detection. 20 seconds, ready positions. The SEALs moved to their predetermined positions, each man responsible for specific sectors and actions during the brief window when they would be most vulnerable. 10 seconds, stand by. The Harrier descended toward the landing zone with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, its downwash creating exactly the kind of chaos that would mask the insertion of 4 of America's most elite warriors. Execute, execute, execute. In less than 30 seconds, 4 shadows disappeared into the jungle, and the Harrier was climbing away from the island, leaving behind only disturbed vegetation and the beginning of what would become a legendary special operations mission. The extraction, 8 hours later, would test every aspect of Zara's planning and the team's adaptation. But as she climbed toward the rendezvous altitude, listening to Rodriguez's voice confirming successful insertion, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had just rewritten the manual for what was possible. 24 hours later, back at Naval Air Station North Island, the debriefing room buzzed with a different energy than before. The mission had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, not just tactically, but strategically. They had proven that innovation could triumph over limitation, that creative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Morrison stood before the same map that had shown only failed attempts just 3 days earlier, but now it bore a new marker, one colored green instead of red. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a satisfaction that came from seeing his people succeed against impossible odds, "what you witnessed is the future of special operations aviation." The SEALs who had participated in the mission sat with the quiet pride of people who had just been part of something historic. Williams, who had initially questioned the feasibility of Zara's approach, now found himself thinking about applications for future missions. "Ma'am," he addressed Zara, "I owe you an apology. I didn't think what you were proposing was possible." "You didn't owe me belief," Zara replied. "You owed your teammates the best chance of success. Questioning assumptions is how we find better ways to do impossible things." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "What's next, Lieutenant Commander? This can't be a one-time thing." Morrison answered before Zara could respond. "What's next is we formalize this capability. We train more pilots, modify more aircraft, and develop doctrine around what Lieutenant Commander Reeves has shown us." The implications were staggering. An entirely new category of special operations support that combined the precision of helicopters with the speed and firepower of jets, operated by pilots trained to think beyond conventional limitations. "Sir," Zara interjected, "there's something else to consider. This technique works because it's unexpected. Once enemy forces adapt to this threat, we'll need to evolve again." "Then we stay ahead of them," Morrison replied. "We keep innovating, keep pushing boundaries, keep finding ways to do things they don't expect." The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to stay in touch. But as the participants filed out, everyone understood they had just witnessed something that would influence military aviation for years to come. Zara gathered her materials with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had proven a point that needed proving. Her call sign, Phantom, had been earned through missions that officially didn't exist, but today it had acquired new meaning. She had shown that sometimes the impossible was just the improbable waiting for the right person to attempt it. Walking across the tarmac toward her staff car, she paused to look back at the Harrier that had made it all possible. The aircraft sat silent under the California sun, looking exactly like it had 3 days earlier, but somehow transformed by what it had accomplished. A young pilot approached, wearing the same expression of curious respect that Zara recognized from her early days when senior aviators had seemed to possess knowledge she couldn't access. "Ma'am, excuse me, Lieutenant Commander Reeves," the pilot's name tag read Patterson, and her wings were still bright with newness. "I heard about the mission. Could I ask, how do you learn to think like that, to see possibilities that other people miss?" Zara smiled, remembering her own journey from uncertain junior officer to someone trusted with the impossible. "Lieutenant Patterson, the first step is understanding that every limitation exists to be tested. The second step is being willing to test them, even when everyone thinks you're wrong. And the third step? The third step is making sure you're right often enough that people start listening, when you say something impossible might just be possible." Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, are you taking on students?" The question opened possibilities that Zara hadn't considered. Training other pilots to think beyond conventional boundaries, developing a cadre of aviators capable of supporting special operations in ways that hadn't existed before, creating a legacy that would outlive any single mission or individual achievement. "Lieutenant, ask me that question again in 6 months after we've figured out how to institutionalize what happened here." She paused, studying the young pilot's expression. "But yes, I think there's going to be a lot to teach, and a lot of people who need to learn it." As Zara drove away from the base, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She had arrived as an observer, someone on the periphery of an operation that belonged to other people. She was leaving as someone who had helped redefine what was possible, not through politics or paperwork, but through the simple act of asking a different question and having the skills to answer it. The radio crackled with routine air traffic control communications, pilots and controllers managing the daily complexity of keeping aircraft safely separated in controlled airspace. But underneath that routine communication, Zara heard something else, the sound of a profession that was always evolving, always adapting, always finding new ways to accomplish missions that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Morrison. "Phantom, formal request coming through channels. Need you to brief Pentagon on techniques and training requirements. History in the making." Zara smiled as she typed her response. "Roger that, ready when they are." The sun was setting behind her as she drove toward whatever came next, but ahead of her stretched possibilities that hadn't existed a week ago. She had proven that sometimes the most important question wasn't whether something could be done, but whether anyone was willing to try it. In the rearview mirror, Naval Air Station North Island grew smaller but somehow more significant, a place where the future of military aviation had just been written by someone who refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. The story of Phantom Reeves was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning.